Tamam. Sanırım bu... should we start?
Yes, we should. Yeah, right away.
Okay.
Right.
Give me
So I'd like to begin. Yeah.
give me 5 seconds to keep this on the screen, and then when I stop sharing, please take the lead.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the World Literature Webinar Series. This series brings together international literary scholars whose work uses conceptual and comparative approaches to think across languages, regions, and literary traditions. We are especially committed to building bridges between different archives, methods, and critical vocabularies in world literature studies. We often trace the idea of world literature back to Goethe's concept of Weltliteratur, which imagined literature moving beyond national boundaries through circulation, translation, and exchange. And that remains a powerful horizon for literary study. At the same time, one of the key questions in contemporary world literature scholarship has been how this global space is actually organized, how texts circulate unevenly, how literary value is produced, and how some traditions are still read through inherited temporal hierarchies. So this broader tension offers a particularly useful frame for today's conversation. And it is a pleasure to have you with us. And we are especially delighted to welcome Professor Hülya Adak this evening. And Professor Adak's talk this evening is titled Unsettling Time Lag in Modernist Literatures from Ottoman and Post-Ottoman Landscapes. Hülya Adak proposes to map out fiction within Ottoman and post-Ottoman literary landscapes that illustrates a contemporaneous movement with European and Anglo-American modernists. Analyzing works from 1909 to 1960, she illustrates how to overcome the limits of theoretical discussions in literary and cultural studies that use European and Anglo-American modernists as the sole harbingers of narrative experimentation and critical political intervention. And vary further of what Shih calls omnipotent definitions mapped onto non-European literatures, she challenges the Eurocentric biases in global literary modernism, defying the study of Ottoman and post-Ottoman authors as late bloomers, according to which non-European literatures lag behind European masterpieces in narrative ingenuity. Lastly, she illustrates methodological shifts that accompany the mapping of Ottoman and post-Ottoman aesthetic experiments in the early decades of the 20th century onto the history of global literary history as contemporaneous with European modernists. Hülya Adak is a senior fellow at the Orient Institute Istanbul der Max Weber Stiftung and visiting professor of gender studies at the Margarita von Brentano Centrum at Freie Universität Berlin. Between 2019 and 2022, she was the director of SU Gender, Sabancı University's Gender and Women's Studies Center. Since 2018, she has served as professor of Ottoman and Turkish studies at the Freie Universität Berlin. Between 2001 and 2024, she was assistant and associate professor of comparative literature and gender studies at Sabancı University. She is the recipient of Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship for Experience Researches and Newton Grant, British Academy with Murat Akser. Her articles in the fields of gender studies, memory and trauma studies, empire studies and nationalism, history of human rights, literature, theater, and film studies have been published in prominent journals. Her recent works include aesthetic interventions to gender-based violence and sexual violence, a special issue of the European Journal of Women's Studies, 2025, with Giulia Garaio, critical perspectives on genocide, history, politics, and aesthetics of 1915, from Routledge 2023, with Müge Gökçek and Ron Sonny, Mapping Gender, What's New and What's Ahead in Ottoman Turkish Studies, Max Weber Stiftung Publications 2022 with Richard Whitman, Performing Turkishness, Politics of Theater in Turkey and its Diasporas, special issue of Comparative Drama 2018 with R.R.2 Altınay, Halde Edip and Political Violence, the Armenian Atrocities, Dictatorship, and Non-Violence from Bilgi University Press 2016 in Turkish, 100 Jahre Türkei, von Revolten, Träumen and Hoffnungen from Unions Verlag Zürich 2010 with Erika Glassen, and So ist das, meine Schöne, Orlando Verlag Berlin with Ayşegül Altınay, Nilgün Bayraktar, and Esin Düzel. Adak is also working on the book Survivor Archives with Melanie Tanielyan and Erda Gökner that received Duke University Franklin Humanities Institute's Book Manuscript Award 2021 and is the co-editor with Özlem Öğüt Yazıcıoğlu of the special issue Ecological Imaginaries in Turkish Literature, Drama, and Film. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hülya Adak.
Thank you, Simla, for this amazing introduction. It was very long, and thank you so much for your generosity, first of all.
My pleasure.
It's wonderful to see some familiar faces. I look forward to meeting some of the faces I have not yet met. It's wonderful to be here and to share some of the recent sort of work that I've been engaged with, and I look forward to your questions, comments at the very end. As Professor Simla Doğangün introduced to us in her wonderful introduction to the series and to my lecture, this is going to be about, this lecture is going to be about time lag and belatedness, and also about trying to unsettle these narrative structures that have been reified in literary scholarship for decades. What happens when we question some of these assumptions, hypotheses, and what silences can we uncover when we look at periods that haven't been explored to a great extent? And how can we practically move on from there to situate, let's say, a particular author, a particular text within a new territory, within a new way of theorizing, a new way of trying to understand periods that have been silenced for a number of political and aesthetic concerns. So we can start the slides, and I'll try to walk you through how I'm going to lead the presentation. Professor Doğangün is going to help me navigate the slides, and I'll be able to then talk about quotations, references, and detailed analyses of the works that we're going to illustrate. So can we see the slides? Perfect. So this is the cover. We can move on from here. Yeah, so this is sort of like the development of the presentation. We're first going to talk about where is this Europe? What does Eurocentrism entail? Which leading works actually try to establish this formation called Europe in some of its spatial fortifications, but also in trying to define which works, which writers belong to this territory that has its grip on something called literary modernism. We're also going to see how this is not just, when we talk about Eurocentrism in literary modernism, we're not just talking about geography, we're not just talking about particular authors who have been under the spotlight. We're also talking about a temporal reification, a temporal fortification. And that period is roughly 1890 to 1950. It seems like that's the period to which European, Anglo-American writers, movements, works belong, and the period in which most of the non-European, non-Anglo-American writers have been exempt from producing works called that would fall under modernism. So looking at it temporally gives us a different focus, I would say. Then we're going to see how the whole discourse of modernization, nation state formation, what happened after World War I, and what happened, of course, if you want to translate this to anti-colonialism movements and post-colonial literatures, what happened after the 1950s and 60s can easily be characterized and studied under belatedness, because of the belated modernities that we're talking about in certain geographic contexts, and how modernist aesthetics in those contexts have actually responded to those belated modernization attempts. So our particular case in this presentation is going to be how Turkish literature has been studied so far, and also illustrating the differences, the variations of the study of Turkish literature, the watershed moment being Orhan Pamuk's Nobel Award. So that basically changed the course of how Turkish literature was studied or even dismissed, and how some of the work that was being done on Turkish literature was published in English and disseminated globally. From here, we're going to turn to a seminal work, so as to see how we have not really explored the beginnings of comparative literature with the work of Erich Auerbach, of course, and mimesis, to the extent of showing some of the silences that I will have already talked about. And the salient silences in the second part of the presentation will be about not being able to refer to 20th century modernist Jewish literature, Jewish authors, not being able to refer to the Holocaust, which is unraveling as Auerbach is writing mimesis, but also in a double entendre, not being able to write about the Armenian genocide. So we're talking about two instances of two world wars and atrocities related to those periods that are left out of one of the canonical works that is hailed as the inception, the predecessor, the beginning of comparative literature. And I'd like to talk about where that will lead us when we try to revisit the period between 1900 and 1950, and we want to pick a work that is about those silences and that is trying to situate itself amidst these multiple layers of silences. So that work is going to be Zabel Yeseyan's My Soul in Exile, and the year is 1922, which is hailed as the annus mirabilis of literary modernism, the miraculous year between Virginia Woolf's Jacob's Room, between the finishing of James Joyce's Ulysses, and before the publication of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. So I'd like to situate My Soul in Exile, Zabel Yeseyan, in between these masterpieces that have been hailed and that have been celebrated for so long as the major works of this Eurocentric, this very Anglo-American-centric canon of literary modernism. After this, I'd like to end with a reference to Goethe and to inclusivity and to ethics when we talk about world literature, and show you how temporality in this instance is about a development, and it's not about a historical development toward modernization, it's not about progress per se, it's not about teleologies of capitalization, it's more about a teleology toward universal humanity. And that being said, what I'm trying to conclude from all of these analyses and these restructurings of our theoretical frameworks is not to have particular texts be circulated through translations globally and to basically end our mission as literary scholars there under the rubric of world literature, but to see if within the silences that the scholarship so far has created, there may be lurking texts that can be reinterpreted for purposes of this type of teleology toward universal humanity. And that's how Zabel Yeseyan connects to this understanding of ethics a la Goethe. So we can move on to the next slide. So let's try to understand what Eurocentrism entails. And let's pick, next slide, let's pick a slew of texts that have been theorizing on modernism for decades now, from the early beginnings of Auerbach in 1946 to 2011 with Pericles Lewis. I'm sure the writers, the scholars, and the texts are quite familiar to all of you here. And here I'd like to talk about how literary modernism's entanglements with modernization and with the calamities of World War I go back to discussions in literary theory in the 1940s. From Auerbach to Marshall Berman, from Malcolm Bradbury to Pericles Lewis, the subject of critical histories of modernity and the narrative ingenuities in dealing with representation as, I quote, a notion of a relationship of crisis between art and history, end quote, and as a condition of the modern, has heralded the role of pioneering European and Anglo-American literary modernists at the expense of the rest of the world. Eurocentrism has been a salient characteristic of many of the debates under comparative literature for decades. But none of the aesthetic periodizations in the history of literature has siloed off of movement and held it exclusively under a European or Anglo-American grip as literary modernism. So this grip is something that we do not see, for instance, when we talk about postmodernism. Postmodernism has been shared globally, with the rise of postcolonial theory and so on, with different parts of the world, generously, I would say. But literary modernism has been under the monopoly of this Eurocentrism for longer than the post-colonial sort of critical interventions. So in that respect, it's really important to ask, how was this Europe that we're talking about, or Eurocentrism, created? How can we understand some of its confinements and its restrictions, and how can we work beyond it? So looking at one of the early moments of theorizing on literary modernism, we run into Erich Auerbach's Mimesis. And the work is titled The Representation of Reality in Western Literature, which he penned in Istanbul between 1942 and 45 in German, and published later after the war in 1946. He devotes the last chapter of Mimesis, entitled The Brown Stocking. It's a chapter that would translate to an ode to literary modernism, with a variety of examples from British and European literatures, including Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, a lengthy discussion of Marcel Proust, James Joyce's Ulysses, an example from, or excerpts from Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, and giving early examples that lead to such modernist masterpieces as Flaubert's Bouvard et Pécuchet and Madame Bovary. The focus of Auerbach's text is to illustrate how Istanbul itself, as the site of writing this work, was removed from libraries that were so integral to European civilization. In fact, Auerbach himself talks about this in a note, to mention why there are no footnotes, endnotes, etc. to the text, and I'll quote from him. Can we just move on to the next slide to see if we have something on Auerbach at our display? And another slide, maybe. Yes, at least we have the cover, and we can see some of the important moments of what I'm talking about regarding Auerbach. And this is a quote from him. I may also mention that the book was written during the war and at Istanbul, where the libraries are not well equipped for European studies. International communications were impeded. I had to dispense with almost all periodicals, with almost all the more recent investigations, and in some cases with reliable critical editions of my texts and codes. So this discussion has dominated literary scholarship for decades, and obviously, this moment of there are no libraries that are endemic to European civilization has been a historical distortion that has been, it's historically imprecise, and it has been contested by many contemporary scholars, including Kader Konuk and others who might be with us today. Obviously, the Kemalist modernizing reforms put universities center stage in this period when Auerbach was invited to Istanbul. And Istanbul University had a library that held expansive collections of European literature. Furthermore, many archives of Greek and Roman manuscripts existed, as well as book collections of monasteries and churches, and were made available to Auerbach as he was producing the work. But I'm showing this not as an instance of historical inaccuracy, but as already a beginning of trying to remove Istanbul, some of the contemporary events that might be happening around Auerbach, away from European civilization. It's the moment of siloing off something called European civilization, and literary modernism itself only belongs to the masterpieces that I detailed, including the Prousts, Woolf's, Joyce's that he talks about. The work was written in and around 1942, and he continued writing it for the next 3 years and published in 1946. Many works followed suit, but they did not, again, question the premises inherent to mimesis that literary modernism itself was a European invention, and that it was exemplified in some of the examples that Auerbach had already listed for us. Can we go back to the first slide where we talk about scholarship? Yeah, here. So I'm going to show you an example from Malcolm Bradbury and James Macfarlane, and this text came 30 years afterwards, after Auerbach's Mimesis was published. And here they pick, for instance, Paris as the ideal site for literary modernism. And they say, we will even trace this back to the 1830s. And I quote, if the movements have to be Bohemian or avant-garde, then Bohemia was active in Paris from the 1830s onwards. Another quotation, if an aesthetic of experimentalism is required, then Émile Zola published Le Roman Expérimental in 1880, end quote. All of the examples in the work titled, and this is a later work, Modernism, this is a guide to European literature from 1890 to 1930, the fourth, I think, are from Europe or England with an additional chapter on Russian modernism. So we move, again, decades, maybe coming to the 21st century, and we're still talking about modernism within the confines of Europe and England, and with additional chapters on Russian modernism. This list can obviously be extended to many scholarly works. Besides, when we get to the year 2007, we see that we are going to shift to Orhan Pamuk's Nobel Prize in 2006, and global literary studies and literary scholarship will suddenly embrace more and more of literary debates, theoretical debates on Turkish literature and a variety of non-European literatures, Middle Eastern literatures, and so on. Sibel Rızık and Güven Güzeldere's special issue of the South Atlantic Quarterly from 2003 is a good case in point, as it sets the tone for this discussion on Turkish culture and literature. My special dossier in the publications of the Modern Language Association, published in 2008, with Jale Parla, Nergis Ertürk, and Ian Almond is quite crucial in talking about Turkish literature within the context of global literary studies. Works by Nergis Ertürk and Azade Seyhan have set the stage for Turkish literature to be highlighted, to be discussed, to be staged, if you will, in theaters of global literary studies. When we get to 2011, and that's the last work by Pericles Lewis called The Cambridge Companion to European Modernism, we see suddenly that we have a shift in the way we're studying literary modernism. Part one of the work is titled Core Modernisms, to include chapters on France, Germany, the Habsburg Empire, Italy, Great Britain, and Russia. And part two is titled Peripheral Modernisms, with Portugal, Spain, Ireland, Scandinavia, Switzerland, Eastern Europe, Greece, and Turkey. So in as late as 2011, we have Turkey being invited to this amazing monopoly on European modernism that was a monopoly till 2011 perhaps, or maybe till the 21st century, and it is included as a peripheral modernism. The chapter is penned by my wonderful colleague Nergis Ertürk, where she basically outlines a series of modernization attempts after the Republic, but also talks about an earlier generation, and this is also extremely innovative for the time. An earlier generation of modernists, starting with Yahya Kemal Beyatlı and his formative exile in Paris between 1903 and 1912. And she points to the visual arts and particularly to the 1914 generation, and talks about them as a heyday, their moment as a heyday of Turkish modernism, but this time coming from the visual and plastic arts. She lists the international renowned poet and playwright Nazım Hikmet, and continues to write an amazing monograph on his work, which I will cite later. But besides these exceptions, she follows the path that has been followed in talking about Turkish literature in this paradigm of the 1920s being the novels of nationalism and realism, and with 1940s starting as a rebellion against this earlier mode, talking about the crisis in the rupture from the Ottoman Empire, and talking about the crisis between art and history, especially through criticisms of speedy modernization, speedy westernization, even though those works, like Tanpınar's works, entertain Occidentalist fantasies. So this is the trajectory of Turkish literature when it follows the time lag paradigm. Let's move on from here a bit further. Yeah. So this is the second part, the second and third parts, tableaus, where we get into these temporal fortifications. And here is a slide with very prominent works on categorizing Turkish literature, and some have been very influential in theorizing on Turkish literature in international contexts, including Azade Seyhan's Tales of Cross Destinies and Nergis Ertürk's Grammatology and Literary Modernity in Turkey. And as I said, the crucial role that these theorizations have is to place Turkish modernization as a latecomer, post-1950s, and as a result of a belated modernization attempts, I would say. And so these works, some of the authors are grappling with aping, imitating their European predecessors, and they're also grappling with the idea of perhaps being derivative, because modernism had its heyday already in their minds. So this is not something that we use as an encyclopedic way of historical periodization. It's something that the authors already feel as they write their work. So I love the way Jale Parla theorizes on this. It's almost as if these authors are authors that are manqué, that they're missing something. They're almost second degree, right? Everything they wanted to do, the creative impulse, the ingenuity in narrative experimentation has been done. So imagine starting to write with this fear in mind that you will never be the first to experiment with those kinds of aesthetic sort of experiments. We can move on. So what happens when we try to unsettle this time lag? Not that it didn't happen. Obviously, when we talk about Turkish modernization, we will talk about belated modernity still. We will talk about Justanis. We will talk about a belatedness in modernism that comes with the likes of Oğuz Atay and Tanpınar and Yusuf Atılgan and others. So my presentation will not erase that period or these discussions out of existence. The presentation will just ask, what happens, however, to those producing between 1900 and 1950? We have a corpus of works, a corpus of writers who wrote contemporaneously with European modernists or Anglo-American modernists. And as I will try to show, they actually also were either part of some of the avant-gardist movements related to European writers, playwrights, poets at the time, or they tried to be innovators in some of the experiments that they did. So let's move on and see how trying to unsettle that period will help us see that an earlier instance of modernism is something that we might also want to incorporate into the global literary map. Let's say we are taking modernism as an aesthetic movement that has ingenious experiments within it, and that we are going to experiment with the stream of consciousness. As Berna Moran has specifically shown us, the stream of consciousness technique was employed by Recaizade Mahmud Ekrem as early as 1886. So if we come to a history of firsts, we are not going to be able to give the flag to a few of the European pioneers whom we think are pioneers. This is obviously not a history that I'm so interested in. I'm just doing this to confuse you a little bit so that we really don't go this path of European writers did it first. So I'm just trying to show you how on the map of chronologies, I will be able to unsettle and refute some of the claims that European and Anglo-American writers were first in all of their experiments. I can show from Sırpı Hüdüsap in Mayda that she is employing stream of consciousness in the epistolary novel that she wrote as early as 1883. I will show as part of this presentation that Zapel Yeseyan perfected the stream of consciousness technique in her works Melihan Nuri Hanım, which I'm not analyzing today, but also in My Soul in Exile, which is going to be the focus of my analysis today. Let's shift to another genre, poetry. And here, Nazım Hikmet seems to take the lead. I would like to show you the brilliant work by Nergis Ertürk on Nazım Hikmet, writing in red. And you will see that free verse was employed by Nazım as early as the 1920s. And in fact, so much so that free verse in Turkish goes under Serbest Nazım. So you see how his name is even associated with the brilliant experiments that he tried in poetry. We can move on to another genre. So perhaps the ending of modernism and the threshold between modernism and postmodernism in theater is the theater of the absurd. And in a series of articles, I tried to show how prior to the giants of the theater of the absurd, including Ionesco and Beckett, prior to the Paris premiere of Waiting for Godot and to the publication of Rhinoceros, Halide Edip published in English this amazing work called Masks or Souls, and it was published in the United States. And it's an amazing work that speaks of the despair in the aftermath of World War II, but also of the despair of not being able to formulate a hopeful future after the speedy modernizing reforms of the 1920s. So it's an amazing satire also of modernization in Turkey. And it's written in English, so it's available to, again, non-Turkish audiences who are not familiar with Turkish. So these instances are there just to really shatter our chronological maps of Europeans and Anglo-Americans did it first, just because they started experimenting with the novel, with theater, or with poetry first as Western genres. Let's move on. Can we move on, please? Thank you. And I wanted to show you one instance basically mapped out brilliantly by Krikor Beledian, Ottoman Armenian writers who were part of avant-gardist movements, exactly at the time when the European avant-garde was in vogue and alive and well. And you see the dates also. I wanted to put the dates there, but Zaryan, Nazaryans, the Mehyan writers, Oshagan, Vorujan, and Parserian were extremely pivotal for their times, and they were either part of the futurists or in contact with avant-gardists, or had established, like the Mehyan writers, their own avant-gardist schools and movements of experimentation. Next slide, please. So after we unsettle this whole temporal fortification and now have questions about what are we going to do with the history of firsts and geniuses, and didn't Joyce do everything first, or wasn't Virginia Woolf the only woman who experimented with the stream of consciousness? Because it seems like, obviously, so far the Eurocentrism we are talking about is a fraternity plus Virginia Woolf and Gertrude Stein sometimes. So I haven't gotten to the point of talking about what a fraternity it is, this Eurocentric way of understanding the masterpieces of the modernist canon. So let's go back to our seminal text, Auerbach, and see more silences, because they have impacted our way of thinking about comparative literature and also about world literature, so much so that we've been blinded to so many of the texts that have been staring at us, but our focus has not geared us in that direction, because the stage was set for us by some of the early works that were produced in extremely dire and extremely cataclysmic times. And I'd like to remind you how Auerbach was in Istanbul in the 1930s and early 40s. And in his text, and this is mentioned by a number of theorists only recently, he did not refer to the Holocaust. That was, of course, between 1942 and 45. He could not cite contemporary modernist Jewish writers. So suddenly we have a European civilization, a European canon without Jewish writers. And if we look at Kafka, it's one of Auerbach's favorite writers. He can only talk about Kafka, not in the literary modernism chapter that I talked about, but early on, next to Ovid's Metamorphoses, and without an index and without notes, and only an expert who reads through the lines can find Kafka there. I mean, it's almost hidden beneath the lines. So you see Kafka, and the only argument we have about Kafka is that Metamorphoses exhibits a similar mixture of rhetoric and realism and the same predilection for a haunting and gruesome distortion of reality, end quote. But it's so between the lines when he's talking about Ovid that you may even miss it. And he continues on page 61, writers such as Kafka, whose world of gruesome distortion suggests the consistency of insanity. I think this is the only reference we have to the Holocaust. Not that Kafka was talking about it, he died much earlier, but that this is about the consistency of the moment of insanity that Kafka saw unraveling before his eyes with World War I that he's able to trace during the 1940s. Can we move on? And what I want to show you, and what is really not studied so eloquently, is that even though Istanbul was obviously a safer place than many cities in Europe under Nazi occupation, it still was a precarious site if one wanted to refer to what was happening in Europe at the time, or the Holocaust, or if one wanted to perhaps make a reference to the First World War and to the Armenian genocide. Just prior to Auerbach's professorship at Istanbul University, the Jewish pogroms in Thrace had taken place in 1934. In 1935, there was a book burning of Franz Werfel's Musada in the Pangaltı Church, very close to Erich Auerbach's office. So imagine, I mean, we have book burnings in Istanbul, and by burning Musada, we're burning not only an alarm that Werfel is setting for the imminent Nazi sort of ascendancy and to the Holocaust, but also the reference of the work to the Armenian genocide of 1915. So it's a double entendre that happens when one burns the book of Franz Werfel in Istanbul in 1935. So Auerbach is writing in this very precarious, very challenging context. We have inspection of Jewish life in Turkey by inspectors who are being sent. I here show you a report, their Schulbericht, which exists of all the university lecturers and professors and teachers who were who took up positions in Istanbul. They were being watched and monitored and investigated. Later, obviously, we have the pogroms of 1955, which is not going to be something that Auerbach is going to be a witness of. But just to show you, for the Jewish communities and the Armenian communities of Turkey, this was not necessarily a safe haven that one might presuppose as the context of this brilliant seminal work that came out of Istanbul in the 40s. We can move on. So what I'm going to do with all of this is to show you how we have, in the seminal work that started comparative literature, we have created a European civilization that's mostly a Christian civilization that doesn't refer to the Jewish literature of modernism. We have also eschewed the Armenian writers who might have been contemporaries of Auerbach. We have silenced the Holocaust and silenced the atrocities of World War I. And we also have not paid attention to some of the important modernists who could actually be formative for the field itself, including Franz Kafka. And the works that have been chosen also do not refer to World War I in some of the atrocities that they represent. For instance, Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway has ample references to the Armenian genocide, but is not cited in Auerbach's Mimesis. So in the last or penultimate episode of our presentation today, I want to do some feminist pearl diving in the terms that Linda Zerilla has stated, a University of Chicago political theorist. And she talks about how we cannot, it's very difficult to talk about a whole genealogy of works, right? I mean, that requires a whole panorama of analysis and will take maybe decades and will be difficult to present in a short presentation like this. Let's just pick one work, one pearl from the period, and see how now, in this new context, new temporal and new conceptual context, Zabel Yeseyan's My Soul in Exile will play out in the annus mirabilis of 1922, just between the publication of Ulysses and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. What if we talked about Zabel Yeseyan's My Soul in Exile, written in Paris, and try to come to a new understanding of how we can make sense of her work. Now, the novella is 39 pages. So we're talking about a very, very short work. And this has been published between her own genealogy of talking about the Adana massacres of 1909 in the work In the Ruins, Among the Ruins, and her transcription of the memoirs of a witness of the genocide called The Agony of a People, and the witness is Haik Toroyan. So written in between two reports, two non-fictional and historical renderings of atrocities, My Soul in Exile is an exploration of almost a Künstlernovella of the possibilities of art, the possibilities of being a woman artist, the possibilities of modernism. What can modernism add to the crisis of representation that she would like to talk about? Just to recap who she is, she was born in Üsküdar in 1878 in Istanbul, and her year of death is unknown, but approximately 1943 in the Stalinist gulags. She was basically accused of being a nationalist during the Stalinist purge, and for the last 6 years of her life could not write, could not produce works, and so on. So she started her writing career very early, at the age of 17. Her higher education took place in Paris, where she continued working at the Sorbonne for quite a few years. And she returned to Istanbul immediately after the Adana massacres, actually a little later than 1908. And she was roughly 30 at the time. She was the only woman intellectual on the list of intellectuals to be deported in 1915, and she escaped. So that's really remarkable about her. This is a very exceptional figure. And we have a few works there. Let's move on to the next slide. So this is the work on the Adana massacres of 1909, which during the massacres, around 30,000 Armenian lives were lost. And the work itself is a monumental account that is explored by Hagop Oshagan in his Panorama of Western Armenian Literature, and you could find an exploration also in Mark Nishanyan's Writers of Disaster to talk about what it means to have such a talented writer become a historian almost, or become a witness to testimony and to atrocities. So the question is less about what she reported and what she did, but more about, should we have this brilliant modernist writer become a secretary to history? That's the representative question that Oshagan and Nishanyan are preoccupied with. So we can move on to the next slide. Here's another work by Meliha Nuri Hanım, which I explore in other presentations. It's a brilliant work based on the Çanakkale sort of expedition, the Dardanelles, and how it was that moment that basically set so many Ottoman intellectuals to denial and silence the genocide that was unraveling in front of their eyes. And again, here we have Yeseyan's treatise on what modernist art should be about. She claims, and I quote, the novel should no longer be a fait accompli, that's the role of history. It should no longer be only the reflection of life, but life itself. So this is how she feels about her work. And this is very close to, there was a discussion here as part of the World Literature series on the worlding of the world. And just to pay reference to Shih, who's one of the theorists that was cited, but it's very similar to the worlding of the world. She would like to have life spring from the pages that she is writing and does not want history to be recorded. She wants to intervene in some of the events that are unraveling in front of her eyes. This is a recent, the cover is a recent translation into Turkish by a wonderful translator and scholar, Mehmet Fatih Uslu. And it's wonderful that we can find so many of her works in Turkish due to his brilliant capacity to translate the works from Armenian to Turkish. We can move on. So now that we have a background of Zabel Yeseyan and many other works and how she escaped, and she died by drowning in 1943 as part of the Stalinist purge, we can maybe move on to an analysis of the work itself. So, My Soul in Exile. And here I would like to mention that it was published in 1922. And let's start with a quotation from the work. She starts with, I return to Constantinople today. It is spring, and the April night with its sultry, fragrant atmosphere fills me with sweet emotion. Standing in my father's nearly deserted house in Bağlarbaşı at the open window all alone, I've been lost in thought for a long time. But I'm not really thinking, of course, nor am I dreaming. Rather, abandoning my soul to a fleeting, undefinable emotion, I silently steep myself in the beauty of nature and by degrees enter into communion with it. End quote. So the temporal framework of the novel is set between 1909 and 1915. So between the Adana massacres and the genocide. So Emma, the narrating eye, who's the painter of the novel, returns to Constantinople to experiment with becoming an artist in her community. April here is, of course, has so many, for us, so many sort of definitions in modernist literature. And if we look at T.S. Eliot, this is the cruelest month in the wasteland, right? April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land. And here we have an April that's full of possibility. And don't forget that the Adana massacres of 1909 also started in April 13. And the roundup of intellectuals in 1915 was the 24th of April. So in between the cruelest of Aprils, she finds this April of hope, this April of possibility. And she says, it's very difficult to do art in her community in Istanbul. And she talks about how she invites community members who are very well educated. I mean, it's not about not understanding, it's not about not appreciating. And here's what happens. Most visits to her house to see her work turn into political disputes. I quote. Talk immediately turned to the counter-revolutionary movement, the massacres in Kilikya, and the pact in the offing between Turks and Armenians. The conversation rapidly became a dispute, and because people had passionate views on the subject, the noisy debate led everyone to forget all restraint. What place was there for painting or art in this hell? Night fell, and my guests left, arguing all the way to the door. They had completely forgotten why they came to see me. End quote. So imagine this artist who can't even present her work because nobody's interested amidst the political strife that exists. So what I want to conclude is that not only can she not come back to the home she thought she had, she also cannot come back. She feels like the canvas is also not conveying a sense of home for her. So between the cruelest April of 1915 and one of the earlier cruelties in 1909, she can find only this moment of hope and ends the novella with a downpour, not of droplets of water, which we find in T.S. Eliot. It's spring rain, it's raining on all the corpses and trying to clear the nature that's been contaminated by corpses. Downpour not of droplets of water from the skies, but of white petals from the blossoming cherry trees. So this is the only moment she has to reflect about being an artist and to reflect about how nature could provide hope for plenty and for life. So you can see how difficult it was afterwards when she started writing testimonies, when she started her ongoing work on trying to listen to witnesses of the atrocities. So let's move on. So last but not least, inclusivity and ethics of world literature. Here I'd like to talk about several theories on world literature that have basically mentioned that globalization is about translation, global circulation, and a spatial dissemination. And I'd like to contest that by showing Goethe's understanding of Weltliteratur. And here, I quote, world literary intercourse has the normative end of revealing universal humanity across particular differences, even as such differences are valued. The particularly literary forms of different nations are bearers of universal human values, Goethe claims. Mutual understanding and tolerance among cultures and nations are valuable ethical and political consequences of the explication of universal humanity, end quote. So here we have an instance of a genealogy, a linearity, a chronology that's moving not toward modernization, progress, etc. It's moving towards the establishment and the attainment of universal humanity and needs to incorporate these different nations, cultures, contexts, literatures into its corpus in the process of its speedy move. The world then becomes a form of relating, belonging, or being with. It becomes a normative force of exchange. So thank you so much. I think I'll end there so that we don't go overboard in terms of time. But I would like to share with you this bibliography, which talks about, again, the 30s and 40s and Auerbach's Istanbul and Turkey, particularly to contextualize, again, some of the silences of our seminal work of comparative literature. It's also important to take a look at some of the works that have critically addressed the theories of time gap, belatedness, and late blooming, I would say, modernist aesthetics, and to also see a few of the examples that I talked about from literary works that have been silenced. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Can you see me here? Because I've already stopped sharing. Well, I'd like to say, first of all, thank you very, very much.
Simla, I'm sorry I'm interrupting. I believe that there's some kind of a problem with your camera. There's only a red screen for us, at least for me. I'm not sure if that's the case.
Yeah, that's what I was just trying to
If I ask, yes, now you're here. Okay.
So, right, now you can see me. That's great. Well, I'd like to say thank you very much, Professor Adak, for this very, very rich and illuminating talk.